Hey, Chris here from IELTS Advantage with another student question. So one of our followers on Facebook asked this question and I'm going to make a little mini lesson in response to it. So how can we know the tenses to use in analysing graphs in writing task 1? So a lot of you liked this question and wanted help with this. So the first thing to remember is you shouldn't go into any part of the test thinking that you're going to use specific tenses. Like, don't go into the test thinking, I'm going to use this tense and this tense. That's the same as driving your car and saying, I'm only going to make right turns and drive at 40 miles an hour. Like, you don't, when you're driving a car, you respond to the conditions on the road. Sometimes you drive slowly, sometimes you drive quickly, sometimes you make right turns, sometimes you make left turns, sometimes you drive straight, sometimes you go backwards. It depends on the situation. And that's exactly the answer to this question. It depends on the data. And how many students think about this is the opposite way. They go in with tenses first and then apply those tenses to the data rather than interpreting the data first and then applying tenses to that interpretation of the data. So I'm going to show you some graphs that I put together, very basic graphs that I've just created myself, but it'll show you how you can think about this. So probably the most confusing aspect, or the thing that people ask about the most, is what tense do you use in a graph like this that has no dates? So this just shows 4 countries, and here we have 17 million, so I'm assuming this is not a year, so just 0 to 17 million. What do you do when there are no dates? Just use present simple. All right, and to talk about something that it shows you now, just use present simple, and that doesn't need to be any more complicated than that. When it does get a little bit more complicated is you will often get data where it shows the past up to the present. So the present, 2019, today is probably somewhere about here. Or you might get a graph that just shows the present and the future. Or you might get a graph like this that shows both the past, the present, and the future. So we'll use this to show you the different types of tenses that you might use. So if I was just introducing this, what does it show us now? What does it show us today? The graph compares 3 lines. In the real test, you're not going to be that simplistic. It's just for the purposes of demonstrating the tenses. But which verb tense do we use here? Again, present simple. We're just talking about what it shows us today, what it shows us right now. So we're using present simple for that, to just talk generally about the graph. But let's say we wanted to talk about this point. So we wanted to talk about the year 2000 at the beginning of the graph, and we're talking about the red line. The red line started at 0, okay? So here we have 0, here we have the red line. What verb tense are we using here? We're using the past simple. So we're using past simple because it's something that started and ended in the past. The same as when you are using the past simple when you're writing a letter or an essay or speaking. The rules of tenses don't change just because you're looking at data. So if you're talking about the past, you use past tenses. If you're talking about the present, you use present tenses. If you're talking about the future, you use future forms. It doesn't really need to get any more complicated than that. By 2010, it had reached 400. So again, talking about the red line, we're talking about this point. So we're talking about a point in the past and it going up to this point. So we're using past perfect. All right, in the same way that we would use past perfect if we were speaking, same way that we would use past perfect when we're writing a letter or an essay. If it's appropriate to use that, because that's what the data shows, use that. Where a lot of confusion happens, where students say, I don't understand which tenses to use in task 1 academic based on these charts. It's nothing to do with the charts, it's nothing to do with the data. It's not because the data is confusing, it's because you don't know how to use tenses. All right, so if you're confused about which tenses to use, you need to go and review those tenses. And for many of you, that could just be, a half a day's work of just going back and reviewing the tenses and looking at timelines and or looking at different scenarios and context and practicing, and that will help you. Because if you combine being quite confused about the data with not being able to use tenses correctly, then you're going to get into all sorts of problems. But don't blame it on the data. If you have a problem with tenses, that's your fault that you need to address. The blue line has stayed the same. So let's talk about the blue line. So generally over the course of the period, and we're talking about the past. So we're talking about from here up to here. What tense is this? The blue line has stayed the same. This is going to be present perfect, all right? Because we're talking about a time in a past that's unspecified up to the present. The blue line has stayed the same. So that's generally what we would use there. The green line will continue to drop in the future. Let's get rid of that. The green line will continue to drop in the future. So we're using future forms here, the future form of will. So we're talking about from here to here. So from 2019 up to the end, the green line will continue to drop in the future. So again, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure that out. You're talking about the future, so you're going to use future forms. Don't overcomplicate it. Don't be thinking like, should I use will or going to, or all these different complicated ways of doing it. Normally the simplest way to do it is the easiest. So this is what you need to do in order to establish which tense to use. Number one, what does the data say? So that's the first step. What data am I talking about? Because if you're talking about this one, so this is the data that we're using, it's obviously going to be different from this one. So what does the data say? You need to understand what that says first, and then which tense is appropriate to describe that data. So what you're doing is you're reacting to the scenario, you're reacting to the data in the same way that a driver would react to the conditions of a road. And when you do that, it becomes much easier. And don't overcomplicate it. Don't overthink it. Students who tend to overthink it, they get themselves into all sorts of trouble because they're like, is it this tense or that tense or that tense? And if you do that, you're going to second guess yourself and you're going to run out of time. So get used to dealing with different charts and graphs and practice them and review your tenses and get a teacher to look at them because they will quickly be able to tell you if you're using the correct tense or not, and getting that feedback will really, really help you. Hope you find that useful, and see you again soon. Bye-bye.